You wake up, and the word that comes is wrong. Not mispronounced, wrong language. The thought forming in your head, simple, just what time is arriving in German. You are 13 years old. You are in a hospital in Knin, Croatia. The people around you, your mother, the nurses, are speaking Croatian, which is the only language you have ever lived in. But when you open your mouth, German comes out. You studied German in school, a year, maybe less, beginner level, badly. You couldn't order food in it, couldn't write a full sentence. But right now, it is the only language your brain will produce. Croatian, your mother's voice, your childhood, the language your thoughts were built in, is somewhere beneath the surface. You can hear it, you cannot speak it. Neurologists who studied Natasha's case and the 200-plus cases of foreign accent syndrome and language crossover documented since the first clinical description in 1907 found something that disrupts everything intuitive about how the brain stores language. A dormant language doesn't disappear when you stop using it. It drops below the threshold of active access, stored in a different neural substrate than your dominant tongue, held in a kind of compressed archive the brain doesn't bother to index because it hasn't been needed. A head trauma, a seizure, a stroke, any interruption to the primary language network's dominance can drop the archive into active rotation while the primary language reboots. The brain is not loyal to the language you grew up in. It is just running whichever file loaded fastest when you were small. Natasha recovered her Croatian after weeks. The German faded. Neurologists are still not fully certain what happened during the gap. Only that the archive was real, the access was real, and the person who emerged from the coma speaking a second language she couldn't previously speak was not pretending. The question that stays is not about Natasha specifically. It is about the languages you half learned, half forgot, never completed. Every one of them is in there, beneath the language you think is you. You are 19. The last thing you remember is the car spinning. Now you are in a Melbourne hospital bed, and the nurse is asking you something in English, and you are answering her in Mandarin Chinese. You studied Mandarin in high school. You were not good at it. Your teacher would probably not have described you as a strong student. But right now, 4 days after a severe car accident left you in a coma, Mandarin is the only language your brain is producing fluently. English, which you have spoken your whole life, feels distant, wrong, like trying to read through frosted glass. Ben McMahon's case was documented extensively in 2012, becoming one of the most studied examples of language crossover post-drama. Neuroimaging conducted during his recovery suggested that the accident had disrupted the cortical dominance of his English language network, while leaving his Mandarin acquisition pathways, physically located in adjacent but distinct neural regions, temporarily intact. His brain had, in effect, defaulted to the secondary system, while the primary one came back online. Within weeks, his English returned. His Mandarin, which he had spoken haltingly before the accident, remained notably stronger afterward than it had been before. He later went to China, worked there, built a life partly in the language that his brain chose for him during the days he couldn't choose anything himself. There is something in McMahon's story that the neurological explanation doesn't fully contain. The idea that you might already speak something you don't know you can speak. That the gap between studied and known is different from the gap between stored and accessible. That somewhere inside the circuitry, the class you half paid attention to at 17 is waiting for the right moment to surface. You are in a coma for 6 days. When you come out of it, you are speaking fluent French. You are also convinced you are Matthew McConaughey. Rory Curtis, a British man who had studied French briefly as a teenager, woke from a medically induced coma in 2012 following a road accident with 2 separate and simultaneous neurological disruptions. foreign language emergence, his English was inaccessible, and French had taken its place as his functional output language, and a dissociative identity displacement that led him to genuinely believe with complete conviction that he was the American actor. Medical staff reported that he asked for his agent, he referenced film roles. His manner, his sense of self, his confidence, all belonged to a persona that was not his. His French, meanwhile, was significantly more fluent than anything he had produced as a teenager. Neurologists treating him noted that both phenomena resolved gradually over the same period. His English returned as his sense of being himself returned. What the parallel recovery suggests is that language identity and personal identity are not separate systems running on independent hardware. They are deeply entangled. The part of the brain that holds who you are and the part that holds how you speak overlap in ways that trauma can expose by disrupting both simultaneously, or by disrupting the architecture that holds them apart. You already know what it feels like to lose yourself in certain moments. What Curtis's case adds is a clinical picture of how far that loss can go and how completely the brain will fill the gap with whatever is available. A character, a language, anything but nothing. You haven't changed languages. You are still speaking English, but you do not sound like yourself. You sound unmistakably as though you grew up in France, despite having never been there, never lived there, never studied French beyond a handful of classroom phrases. Every vowel, every intonation, every consonant cluster. The French accent is not an affectation. You cannot turn it off. Kay Russell, a British woman from Gloucestershire, developed foreign accent syndrome following a severe migraine in 2010. She did not wake up speaking French. She woke up speaking English in a French accent she had never possessed and could not control. The accent was not perfectly French in the linguistic sense. It was perceived by listeners as French, and Russell herself could hear the difference from her previous speech, but was helpless to correct it. Foreign accent syndrome, which has been documented in over 100 cases since its formal classification, is not a language disorder in the conventional sense. It is a motor speech disorder, a disruption to the precise muscular sequencing required to produce the phonemes of your native language in their correct formation. When the coordination breaks down and partially repairs itself, the resulting phoneme pattern can sound, to the human ear, like a foreign accent, even though no foreign language is actually being accessed. The brain is producing approximations of its native sounds that happen to map onto the phonological patterns of other languages. Russell spent years attempting to recover her original accent through speech therapy. Progress was partial. She described the experience not as speaking a foreign language, but as being trapped inside a voice that did not belong to her. Her thoughts, her words, her vocabulary entirely intact, but the delivery permanently borrowed from somewhere else. The question her case leaves open is worth sitting with. How much of what you call your voice is actually you, and how much is just the precise motor pattern your brain happened to settle into before you were old enough to notice it was a choice? You have a fever for 3 days. On the 4th day, the fever breaks, and you sit up in bed in your home in Vietnam and speak Russian. You are 12 years old. You do not know Russian. No one in your family knows Russian. You have had no exposure to the Russian language that anyone can trace. Pham Thi Lien, case documented by Vietnamese medical researchers in the early 2000s, is one of the more extreme examples in the literature because it appears to lack even the partial prior exposure that typically explains language crossover. McMahon had studied Mandarin. Natasha had studied German. Curtis had studied French. Lien had no documented Russian exposure. She produced Russian words, Russian phonological patterns, and some Russian grammatical structures during a period of several weeks following her illness. The case exists in a contested area of the literature. Some researchers argue that cryptomnesia, the unconscious retention of information from a source the conscious mind has forgotten, may explain apparent zero-exposure cases. A radio broadcast, a film playing in another room, a conversation overheard and not registered. The brain stores more than it reports. Others argue that cases like Lien's require a more radical explanation, that the brain's language acquisition hardware, when destabilized, may be capable of generating phonological patterns that approximate existing languages through a kind of recombination without any prior input from that specific language. The honest answer is that nobody fully knows. The case remains open, which is either uncomfortable or fascinating, depending on how you think about the relationship between what your brain has absorbed and what you believe you know. Somewhere in you is everything you have ever heard, most of it below the threshold of what you would call memory. The question is what it would take to surface it.
You speak two languages. You have for years. One of them is the language of your childhood, your first thoughts, your mother's face. The other is the language you learned as an adult, studied, practiced, built gradually from nothing into something functional. They coexist. You switch between them. You do not think of them as separate systems so much as separate rooms in the same building. Grant, a bilingual Australian man whose case was studied by researchers at Sydney's Brain and Mind Centre in 2017, suffered a stroke that selectively damaged his English output while leaving his second language, Mandarin, which he had learned as an adult, temporarily unaffected. He could not speak to his family in English. He could speak fluently to strangers in a language he had only acquired later in life. The rooms were still there. A door had closed in one direction. What his case adds to the literature is a counterpoint to the standard assumption about which language survives trauma. It is not always the mother tongue. It is not always the dominant language. It is not always the language the person would consciously choose. The brain's language architecture, as researchers at the center noted, is not organized according to emotional priority or frequency of use alone. It is organized according to the physical substrate each language happens to occupy, which is influenced by when it was learned, how it was learned, and which neural pathways became most efficient for its production. Language is not ranked by love. It is ranked by efficiency. The one that wired itself most cleanly is the one that survives longest. The languages you have learned, abandoned, half forgotten, never quite mastered, they are not lost. They are in different rooms, behind different doors, in a building larger than you have ever had reason to map. Most people never find out how large it is. The ones in these cases found out in the worst possible way, and what they came back reporting is the same thing every time. There was more in there than they knew.